Story 1. The car in my garage, which I've driven twice this week and 6 times in the past 2, was built in 1970. It still has points and condenser ignition with mechanical fuel injection. There is a guy across the street from me with a 1963 Triumph. Together, we will have the only running cars in the neighborhood if someone uses an electromagnetic pulse on the eastern seaboard. Story 2. I've got a flat and round, smooth granite rock that I use as either a doorstop or, after washing and disinfecting, I use it to hammer and roll schnitzels in the kitchen. Sometimes I also use it as a base when I have to punch rivets and buttons when I'm working with leather. An estimated guess at its age is somewhere between 2,100 million years and 900 million years. That's the typical age for Danish granite. I'm living in Denmark, and I found the rock on the beach some years ago. Ancient multi-tool. Story 3. When my wife's grandfather passed away when we were in college, I helped them clean out the house because her grandma was going to assisted care. Her grandfather had 2 super old radios in a beautiful wood finish, and her dad let me keep one. It's in my office, and I listen to Tigers games in the background while I work, or sometimes when I can't stand college football announcers, I mute the TV and turn on the radio to listen to the game. Crackles and sounds like someone broadcasting the game from a World War II bomber, but I love it. It reminds me of listening to games as a child with my dad. Story 4. I'm a computer numerical control machinist. Computer numerical controls were able to cut with 0.001-inch precision in the 1980s, and steel hasn't suddenly needed to get more precise than that in the time since. New computer numerical controls are expensive, so there's a huge emphasis on repair and retrofitting over replacement. All of which is to say that my company is currently running a machine that's controlled by a 20-year-old laptop using a Universal Serial Bus 2.0 to serial port connector, which is plugged into a null modem with a physical pinout. If you don't know what that is, that's because not very many people used computers when null modems with physical pinouts were current technology. Suffice to say that the laptop is stretching the back compatibility of its physical ports and of Windows XP to be able to run the hardware and software that actually manage the lathe. Story 5. It depends on how you define technology. I guess. If we mean the oldest object I still use, I have a cast iron frying pan from the 1920s that I still use daily. But is that technology? The oldest electronic device I use regularly is probably an alarm clock that I got in the early 1990s that still works perfectly. Story 6. I still have an iPod Nano that I use when I'm commuting on the train to work every day. And if this one breaks, I've got a backup one in my drawer at home. Story 7. Maybe not a piece, but the prototype solar hot water system in my house is still functioning perfectly. I've had to do some repairs, of course, but it's still working. It's our hot water and the heat for winter. It's from 1983, and the technology started in 1977 but was sold to customers at the time as a prototype. Suncatcher Solar Systems is the name, although they are not owned by the same people these days. The system uses a pure silicon heat exchanger. The people who sold the units had to sell them as prototypes because the heat exchanger was awaiting patent approval. Who was patenting this system? The engineer who used that heat exchanger on the space shuttles. Yes, I have a space shuttle-based prototype heat exchanger in my home. Story 8. I still use my 2013 Panasonic GX7 camera with a lens from 2009 when I need a better than smartphone photo. I did have a not much younger Sony RX100 Mark IV, but it stopped switching on, so I just went back to the GX7. Story 9. My alarm clock from middle school has been waking me up with that awful beeping sound since 1992. At this point, I think I'm too emotionally attached to replace it. Story 10. 90-year-old radio in my living room. Granted, I slightly modified it to also run on Bluetooth and auxiliary cable for my phone or iPod, but it still works as a radio, vacuum tubes and all. Story 11. I still use an old printer, one of those big ones with giant cartridges. Although it has its age, it still prints without any problems. Sometimes I'm surprised how well it works, despite being so vintage. Story 12. I use a portable dishwasher from the early 80s. It kind of just got handed down throughout the generations. I will replace it when it finally dies, but it works super well and is pretty efficient, so why not keep using it? Story 13. My great-aunt's cast iron skillet from the 1940s has incredible seasoning, making perfect cornbread every single time. Modern non-stick pans could never compare. Story 14. Some of my hand tools are from the 1920s, and they work like a dream. I have a 1940s bandsaw and drill press that still work great. My oldest tool that I use at least once a month as a do-it-yourselfer is an 1880s hand plane my great-great-grandfather must have purchased when he came to America. Story 15. I regularly use my 1990 Macintosh Classic for games and some label making, printed on my image writer too. I also use my early 1970s hi-fi sound system every day. Story 16. Granted, there was about 30 years of disuse, but I found and refurbished my original Game Boy 2 years ago and still play it now. The nostalgia is so strong that I keep picking it up. Story 17. We use an ancient point-of-sale software in my office. I'm talking old. I think only 2 people in my company know how to recode it each season when our tickets change. It looks like someone assembled the user interface in Microsoft Paint. It would probably run better on Windows 95. Story 18. At work, we still use a very specific industry standard architecture card for something. Nobody makes a modern equivalent for this, and the person who originally made it is long since gone. We have 8 of them, and once they fail, I have no idea what we'll do. In 20 years, we've never been able to come up with a backup plan for if or when that happens. Personally, my oldest piece of technology one still use is probably my 16-year-old 52-inch Samsung liquid crystal display television that just refuses to fail. I want a new television, but I just can't justify it when that old workhorse is still running strong. Not even a single dead pixel in 16 years. I also still have the PlayStation 2 I bought 23 years ago, which still works fine, but it falls under the chilling in a drawer somewhere category. Story 19. Computer digital technology. My dad's HP 12C financial calculator. I got it when he passed away, and I know he had it as far back as 1982 or 1983. They were released in 1981. Story 20. No idea exactly how old it is, but the place was updated sometime in the mid-1980s after being built in 1970. We still have the microwave that came with the house in 2001. It's built in above the stove. Story 21. The keyboard I am typing on, an IBM Spacesaver keyboard, has a PS/2 mouse and keyboard connector on it. And it wasn't immediately before the changeover to USB. Story 22. I have the grandfather clock my parents got as a wedding present back in 1978. If that doesn't count, I also have a pizza oven that was made in the late 1980s. It's on my kitchen counter and gets used several times a week. Story 23. My garage stereo equipment is from the early 1980s. Phased linear amplifier and preamplifier. Advent speakers. Fisher CD player. I sold the reel-to-reel tape deck and cassette tape deck. The turntable and dynamic range expander are in boxes in my basement. Story 24. 1965 Fender Bandmaster guitar amplifier. Add a couple of vintage 70s gain pedals, and it delivers a mighty, ferocious sludge metal tone that cannot be replicated by today's digital amplifier modelers. Story 25. Oldest electrical device, electric knife. I'm pretty sure it was made in 1987. Oldest piece of technology, 2011 model Hewlett-Packard laptop I turned into a Chromebook and use for occasional word processing. Story 26. I still use my Palm Pilot for scheduling and note-keeping. Just kidding. 3Com was basically the original smart device company, but they rested on their laurels and Apple and the rest supplanted them. Story 27. My ancient rice cooker from college is literally older than my teenager. It has a broken hinge, and the timer is wonky, but it makes perfect rice every single time. Story 28. My Gaggia Classic Espresso machine from 2004. With the occasional clean and service, it still works as well as it did the day I bought it. Built very robustly and pretty easy to service at home. Story 29. I have plenty of old things I use occasionally, but frequently I'd have to say my CD stomper. It is a device for labeling optical media, which I also use frequently. Story 30. My grandfather's Thomas shelf clock. I just had it refurbished. Wind it once a week, and it chimes the hour and then one chime at the half hour. It was made in 1905 and brings back many fond childhood memories of visiting their home back in the 1960s and 1970s. Story 31. I'm only 23, so bear with me. I still use an old original Xbox from 2003, as well as iPod Touch 2nd and 4th generation, and an iPod Mini 4th generation. I still use my old Nintendo DS Lite too, so it's not as old as others, but old for me. Story 32. I don't know if you would consider it technology, but I shave with an Army-issued 1918 Gillette safety razor. Other than that, it is probably the 1960s rotary phone that I use. Story 33. I have an old Canon AE-1 camera that I still use occasionally to shoot film. I don't know when it was made, but even if it was the last year of production, it's at least 40 years old. Story 34. My fridge is an Amana that is probably from the 1970s or 1980s. So much better than new refrigerators. The freezer has a dehumidifier, and the excess moisture collects in a pan and drains out the bottom. Story 35. Every morning I wind the clock. It's 234 years old and keeps nearly perfect time. The ticking is like the heartbeat of our house. It's also the only way I know if the clock's changed for daylight savings. The other morning it rang 7 times at 6 a.m. Story 36. The calculator on my desk at work is a little solar-powered Casio that I've had for at least 35 years. It's easier at work than using the application on my phone. I don't use it a lot, but it does get used most days. Story 37. I have a 200-year-old ivory stylus. I'll use it a few times a month for some scratchy doodles. I have a couple of century books I use as a stand for some houseplants. My PlayStation 2 is my only DVD and CD player. My Nintendo DS Lite is my ebook reader. Story 38. A 1967 Trainer guitar mate 2 guitar amplifier. Hand-built in Toronto. Every once in a while, it hits me that I'm lugging around a nearly 60-year-old piece of music equipment to dive bars. Story 39. Electronic tech or just tech in general? Electronic, I have an alarm clock that was built in the 1970s, yes, the one you just pictured. In general, a sharpening wheel made in 1956. Story 40. I received a piping cursor in 2005, but it is actually from the mid-1990s. It has standard dimensions for pipes, fittings, valves, etc. on a plastic sheet that you can move to get the specific nominal diameter you are looking for. I don't know if it classifies as technology, but it is a weird gizmo that people usually mention when they see it. Old school engineers always take it and start telling me stories about theirs. Story 41. I use a Neo 2 anytime I'm out somewhere I need to type but don't want to risk using a laptop. Check out the Writer Deck subreddit for examples of other people's vintage tech for distraction-free writing. Story 42. I have a toaster from the 1930s that we use for toasting bagels on the weekend, and a toaster from the 1950s that we use for regular sliced bread. Neither one works like a standard pop-up toaster. The 1930s toaster has sides that fold up and down, and the bread flips itself over to toast the other side. The 1950s toaster has a little conveyor belt that takes bread through from the left to the right and flops the toasted bread out onto the plate. Both are heavy chrome-plated. Story 43. Surely the right answer is going to be a piece of technology so old that virtually no one alive today would immediately even classify it as technology. Maybe a stupid question, but do we actually know what the first technology ever was that still sees use today? If we're allowed category answers, I would probably go with knife as my answer, as I suspect the earliest humans learned how to make pointy sharp things even before wheels and fire, but I could definitely be wrong. Story 44. I have a Mosin Nagant sitting next to me in my deer stand with a build date of 1943, a tire pressure gauge that came with a Model T Ford my great-grandpa bought new. I forget the year of that, 2 single-shot shotguns from Sears and Roebuck from the 1950s, some Snap-on tools my grandpa gave me that he bought in the 1960s, and my wood stove my grandpa got from his grandpa who made it in the 1890s. Story 45. I have several things I still use regularly to cook, such as a hand-crank pasta roller, roasting pan, wooden spoon, and stock pot that I got from my great-grandma. She acquired each one of them in Italy before she moved to the United States in 1928, so they are at least that old. Story 46. I have a calculator from 1986 that still sees regular use. I do have some older technology that does get used from time to time, but not with real regularity. Story 47. I'm not sure. I suppose clothing. Modern clothing is made using different methods, but clothing itself as a technology is probably the oldest technology we use. Story 48. Ceramic items such as plates and mugs, closely followed by anything made of glass. If we're considering type of thing rather than materials, knives. Knives are very old. Story 49. I wear a Timex digital watch manufactured in August 1993. The table fan by my bed is a General Electric from 1963 or thereabouts. It's plugged into a smart outlet so Alexa can turn it on and off for me. I repainted it so it looks nice again. Story 50. A shovel. Agriculture is one of the earliest applications of technology, converting knowledge of how plants grow into practical applications. Was the intent to inquire about technology that is comprised of electronics? Story 51. Last place I worked used a registration and billing system from 1981, which is an IBM AS/400 system that's still in use today. Personally, I have several video games from the 1980s and 1990s that I still play on a semi-regular basis. Story 52. My mechanical wristwatch uses pretty old technology by Omega. Still, it's a phenomenal watch. My Solar Texas Instruments calculator was given to me by my dad some 25 years ago and works flawlessly. I prefer to use it for work instead of a personal computer or phone calculator. Story 53. My original 5 GB iPod with a spinning hard drive in it is always plugged into an AC adapter in one of those Apple hi-fi speakers in my art studio so I can listen to some tunes. Story 54. Our washer and dryer came with the house and have to be from the 90s. They work amazingly despite looking ancient and being held closed with a wooden stake screwed next to the door. Story 55. Original Nintendo and games. My kid is a Nintendo aficionado, specifically Super Mario Bros. He likes all the retro consoles. He also has a Nintendo Wii, original Sega Genesis, Nintendo DS, Nintendo 3DS, as well as a Nintendo Switch. He's 12.